Hello, this is Terry with Fortres Grand Corporation, and today we're going to talk about Fortres 101.10, Effective Desktop Protection for Windows. Today we'll take a look at the Fortres 101 features, how Fortres 101.10 works, as well as how to get started with Fortres 101.10, where we'll open the interface and take a look at the security options that are available and some of the things that you can configure. Fortres 101 is restrictive security. Clean Slate is our non-restrictive security product that lets users do whatever they want and clean up the changes when they log off. Fortres 101, on the other hand, is restrictive security that allows you to lock down elements of the desktop, the file system, the registry, websites, and also block keystrokes. And by locking down these different areas, you're able to preserve the state of the machine for your public access users. The configuration of Fortres 101 is fairly easy. You can do things like enable and disable security without rebooting. You can also customize the security by user or computer, and you do this by placing them in groups. If you use our central control product, which is a separate product that you install on the server, you can store all of the settings on your network so that you can have all of the computers with Fortres 101 get their settings from the network and not have to go around to each computer and configure it individually. The security in Fortres 101 is also very flexible. You can do things like make the hard drive read-only, but even with the hard drive read-only, you can exempt applications such as antivirus programs from the security and let them be privileged and have access to different files or folders or the registry. It's also very easy to accommodate system management software with Fortres 101. Things like SCCM or Altiris or Landesk that have an agent that you can use to manage the computers can be easily exempted from the Fortres 101 security. Fortres 101.10 supports Windows 10. It's one of the new features in version 10. It also still supports Windows 8.1, Windows 8, and Windows 7. We also have a Kiosk Mode that allows you to launch a single program or website at logon, so that if you are setting up a single-purpose computer that users just walk up to, maybe a card catalog or some other information kiosk, you can use Fortres 101 so that whenever the machine boots, it auto-logs in, and once it auto-logs in, it launches that program or website. And then you can also block keystrokes so that users are only able to interact with that single program or website. The internet filtering is modified in version 10 so that it doesn't require a separate installation. You can also have a custom redirect for blocked sites. So if you want to have a certain page of your own be displayed when a user goes to a blocked website, you can do that through the internet filtering. The goal of Fortres 101 is to save time, and we do this by preventing unwanted changes. You can do things like restrict users from running programs from USB drives so that a user doesn't come in, insert a USB drive into the computer, and then run whatever program they've downloaded at home. We also have zero-day malware protection, so things like executable files can't be modified by default, and also the master boot record is protected so it can't be overwritten by malicious software. And the goal of all this is to reduce support calls and save time managing your desktops. The installation for Fortres 101 is pretty straightforward. It's a typical exe installer that can take command line parameters so that it can be run silently. It also supports imaging so that you don't have to do anything after you deploy your image. You can actually create your image with Fortres 101 already on the computer, and it won't interfere with your post-imaging tasks. As with all of our software, we have free technical support, either by toll-free phone, email, or chat, and this doesn't require any maintenance. Fortres 101 works by intercepting the different areas of the system like file access, registry access, internet access through web pages, and also the user doing things on the desktop. And so it sits in the middle and looks at the configuration that you've set up for that security group and decides whether or not file operation should be allowed or denied based on those security settings. The same thing is true of registry keys or web pages or moving things around on the desktop. If you have those things locked down, the user won't be able to do that. In the case of a file, typically they'll receive an access denied message. The same would be true with registry keys. In the case of web pages, they could be redirected to your own custom URL or just receive a generic access denied message. And in the desktop, dragging things around is typically blocked, and it doesn't allow the user to do it in the first place. With the different areas of security, there are different types of permissions you can control. With files, you can have a file either be full access, read-only, or no access, and we'll talk about what those mean in just a minute. There's also hidden and browsable, which I don't really recommend using except in special circumstances where you can actually hide files. It's better from a security standpoint to actually protect the files from being modified or opened in the first place instead of just relying on them being hidden where the user could still open them if they knew the exact path to the file. With registry keys, it's either accessible and can be modified or it's read-only. Websites are either allowed or denied, and items on the desktop are either allowed or denied as well. To get started with Fortres 101, you would go to our website, fortresgrant.com, and download a free 30-day trial of Fortres 101 and install it on either a Windows 10, Windows 8.1, Windows 8, or Windows 7 computer. And when you do that, it'll prompt you to install in local mode by default, where all the settings will be stored on the local computer, and you'll be prompted at the end of the installation to create a password. Once you reboot the computer at the end of the install, you can log back in and open the security interface using either the Control-Shift-F hotkey sequence, or you can double-click on the Fortres 101 tray icon. The default settings, if you're logged in as a restricted user, is to lock the system tray, so be aware that you may not be able to double-click on the Fortres 101 tray icon. So the preferred method is to use Control-Shift-F hotkey, and that will bring up the password screen. So let me minimize this, and I'm going to go ahead and open up the security interface here. I did the Control-Shift-F, and I'm going to put in my password that I set during the installation. Now I have both Clean Slate and Fortres 101 installed on this computer, so I'm going to focus just on Fortres 101 for this webinar. You can see there are different groups of settings, basic settings, desktop, Windows 8, file and registry, and we're going to take a look at some of those in just a few minutes. Inside of the security interface, you configure the security using groups. You can see down in the system tray that the current group is default, and you can also see that we're not using central control, so everything that we do is only going to affect this computer. If I wanted to create another group, I could go to the Security Group Manager, and this is what it would look like by default when you install Fortres 101.10. You have a single default group, and that's going to apply to all users and all computers. The way the Group Manager works is we try to find the computer name and the username inside of this list of users and computers in the Fortres Grant groups. If we do not find that computer name or username in the list, then users just get the default security. So what I can do is click on New and maybe create a staff group. And then I can browse, in this case, my local computer, and it'll get the local users and groups off of this computer. And I can drag and drop them. Maybe this admin user, we'll drop him into staff. And now if the admin user logs in, he'll get the security that's associated with the staff group. Everyone else will just get the default security. You can also assign computers to groups, and computers actually have a higher priority than users. So if I were to set up a kiosk computer, I could have that group, and I could drag this computer and put it into the kiosk computers. And now anybody that logs in on the FGC webinar computer will get the kiosk computer security. If the user admin logs in anywhere other than this webinar computer, that user, the admin user, will get the staff security, and everyone else that logs in on any other computer will get the default security. So it's the computer first, then the user, then the default when we're looking at the group security. If I was connected to central control, instead of viewing users from my local computer, I would see users from Active Directory if I had installed central control on a domain controller. You can also configure LDAP settings, and you can't do this in local mode, but you can do it in network mode when central control is active. You could point it at a domain controller and just have central control installed on just a regular member server. So I'm going to go ahead and close the Security Group Manager. Once I do that, the changes that I've made inside of the Group Manager are automatically saved. If I go to the Group menu, I can switch between my kiosk computers group and my staff group, and that's how I would edit the settings for that group. So I'm going to go ahead and just select the default group, and we'll take a look at some of the actual Fortress 101 settings. Under the basic settings, there are 4 options. There's the Fortress 101 security option, which is either enabled or disabled, and this is basically whether security is active or disabled, and this is for the group. If I wanted to change it, I can just double click and set it to be disabled and press OK, and once I went and did a file save, that would disable the security for anybody that belongs to that group. We'll go ahead and leave that back at enabled, which is the default. By default, security is not applied to administrators, so we take the same approach as Windows does, where if you log in as an administrator, you don't have security. If you have users that do need to have security enabled and they are administrators, you can double click and enable the apply security restrictions to administrators, and that will turn security on for admins. There is a status icon in the system tray. If I come down, it's either a red X or a green check mark if security is enabled. It tells me that it's disabled because of the computer. And what that means is that on the file menu, I have disabled all security on this computer. That's a local setting. Even if I was connected to central control, it would only apply to this computer, and it would stay disabled until I came back in and turned the security back on. There is an option to automatically configure special applications that I'll talk about in a few minutes when we get to the special applications list. So for now, we'll just skip over that. On the desktop settings, there are a lot of options, and they basically correspond to different items on the desktop that the user might be able to interact with and that you can lock down. The first one is the Start menu. By default, with Fortress 101, the Start menu is disabled, so users can only run programs that are either on the desktop or the taskbar. And so the normal situation or installation for Fortress 101 is to set up your computer, install all of your applications, place shortcuts to the programs you want users to have access to on the desktop, then install Fortress, and it will lock down the desktop so that every time a user logs in, the icons are in the exact same place, and they can launch anything that's on the desktop or the taskbar, but not anything in the Start menu. My Computer, Control Panel, Network Places, the Recycle Bin are all icons that are on the desktop that are disabled by default. Explorer Search prevents you from getting into the search window of an Explorer window. So if I were to open up an Explorer window and do the search in here, that would not work. Printers and faxes disables access to the printers and faxes control panel applet. The system tray is also disabled, and when the system tray is disabled, you can hover over tray icons and get the status, but you can't click or right-click on the tray icons and interact with them. Explorer windows and shell folders are 2 things that are enabled on the desktop settings page, and that is so that you can actually create a folder of application shortcuts on the desktop, maybe for Microsoft Office, and put all of the Office apps into a folder and then allow users to open that folder and run the programs that are in there. If I were to disable the shell folders and Explorer windows, they wouldn't be able to open that folder, and they would just get an error message instead. Shell context menus just refers to right-clicking on the desktop, and when that's disabled, you wouldn't be able to right-click and have a menu pop up. Altering icons means you can't rename or move and drag the icons around on the desktop. Moving files in Explorer prevents you from dragging a file from one Explorer window to another, so if you wanted to allow users to maybe drag a file from their desktop to a thumb drive, you would want to enable the Move File in Explorer option so that they could do that. We do disable saving files to the desktop by default. It's a very common request. This is actually implemented through file security, but we put it on the desktop settings because it was requested so much and that people wanted to prevent users from saving things to the desktop. So that is disabled here. The next set of options all relate to elements of Explorer windows. There's shell toolbars, breadcrumb bars, navigation buttons, the favorite panes, and the common task panes. And if I open up an Explorer window here, let me move this off to the side. These are the navigation buttons. This is the breadcrumb bar. This is the shell favorites pane or the common tasks pane. And so those things can all be blocked so that you can still open this window and use the main part of the window, but you can't access the different elements around it. We do still have options for sidebar gadgets because you can still run those in Windows 7. So those are in here. Disables by default. Most people don't use them, so you probably won't even notice any impact from those options. There's also an option to disable a command prompt so that users aren't able to open a command prompt and start searching through the drive. And then we have a couple of options that were requested frequently, but we didn't want to make them restricted by default, and that's access to the help files as well as printing support. So you could easily disable printing by double-clicking and choosing disabled. One thing to note is that this disables all printing, and there isn't a way in Fortres 101 to select which printers you want to give access to and which printers you want to restrict. The shell objects page is kind of a holdover from older versions, but it allows you to take icons on the desktop and make them non-accessible. I really don't recommend using the shell objects page because it only protects the program from being run from the shortcut on the desktop. If you had another way of launching the application, you could still start it that way. So we left it in there in case people were using it, but if you want to use it to restrict access to something on the desktop, the better thing to do is to actually make the executable no access, which we'll see in a minute. There's a policy restrictions option. It's a little bit advanced to use this, but basically what it will do is it will allow you to put in settings for Windows policies, and Fortres 101 will make it appear as though that group policy is set on the computer even if you're not using group policies. So it kind of is a shortcut to using group policies without having to actually set it up in Active Directory and do everything with your domain. The values that are in here, the easiest way to get them is to contact technical support and say you'd like to use this Windows policy to lock something down. In this case, not allowing changes to the start menu or not allowing changes to wallpaper or default settings. If there are other Windows policies you're familiar with and want to use, you can contact us and we can get you the setting that you would need to put into this list. Okay, on the Windows 8 settings page, you have options to disable the charms bar and all the individual charms. You can also prevent them from changing the start screen panels or using the task switching bar or using the project screen option. So these are mostly disabled, but you can enable them if you are using Windows 8 and have Fortres 101 installed. The file and registry settings are where the bulk of the security settings are configured, and this is where you actually set up your file permissions and what you want to be blocked. We do have fairly extensive default settings, and the main settings is that there are no access for system utilities like regedit, setup, task manager, sysedit, and all of these EXEs are made no access, meaning that they can't be opened to run. You can't delete them, you can't make changes to them, and so anything that's in the no access files, folders, and executables list is blocked from any kind of modification or any kind of access from the user. So when the default settings are in here, the user is not going to be able to run the task manager or the registry editor. If I wanted to add a new item, I would just click on the column header and I could put in, say, notepad.exe, and now users wouldn't be allowed to run Notepad. If I want to delete an option, I can just right click and choose delete or hit the delete key. And when I'm done, I just press OK. We also have a number of read-only file extensions, and for this we use wildcards. And so basically we've made executable file types like EXEs and DLLs or application extensions, batch files and device drivers, and some other ones like shortcuts. We make those read-only so that users can still open the EXEs that you have installed on your computer, but they can't make changes or delete the EXEs that are there. So this allows them to be run but not modified, which is typically what you would want on a public access computer. Again, I can just click and add anything else that I wanted. If I wanted text files to be read-only, I can put in start.txt, and now text files will be read-only as well. If you happen to make an error in configuring and delete a bunch of the settings, you can always use the restore default, and that'll put the default settings back. The no security files and folders list are files that can be opened, changed, deleted, new ones saved, and by default this list is empty because we allow those file operations to happen unless they're in the no access or the read-only list. It's also worth pointing out that NTFS permissions are still applied, so if I log in as a regular user and I'm trying to save something to the Windows folder or program files, I'm generally going to be blocked through NTFS from making changes to there. So we don't replace the NTFS permissions or another layer on top of it that's a little bit easier to work with and use wildcards to configure, and also things like environment variables. Environment variables come into play and are useful when you're trying to allow users to save to a specific folder. So if I wanted to, for instance, allow users to save to their My Documents or into a certain folder, maybe the desktop, I could put in /users and specify the path and end it with a / so that Fortres 101 knows that I'm talking about a folder. As you can imagine, if you have thousands of users, you don't want to have to list all of their desktop folders inside of this window. So what you can do is use the %user_profile environment variable and put in %user_profile %desktop. And now what will happen is whenever Fortres loads the security and the user logs in, we'll find out from the operating system where their user profile folder is located, and then we'll make the desktop subfolder of that folder accessible where they can save. So again, you can use wildcards, you can use environment variables, and make the configuration a lot easier. The protected registry keys works very similar to the read-only no-write files and folders, except for it applies to the registry. So if I wanted to maybe make a registry key read-only, I could go to HKey current user and software and maybe macromedia and make that registry key read-only. And so now for each user, the security on the registry key will be that it's read-only. And just as with the file system, the normal registry permissions are still enforced. So if the user doesn't have access to modify the registry key, it'll be read-only for that reason as well. We'll go back up to the top for the block execution of installed applications. This is an easy way to select programs that you don't want the users to run. It basically gives you a replica of the start menu. And so if I didn't want somebody to run the immersive control panel, I can just put a check in the box. And now control.exe will essentially be added to that no access list so that the users can't make any changes to the exe or run control.exe in this case. If I want to allow access, I can just uncheck it and then hit OK. I'm going to jump over the privileged applications and come back to that one. It's very easy to set up read-only drives and non-executable drives. By default, Fortres 101 does make removable drives non-executable so that users can't plug in a thumb drive and just run any program that they've brought from some other system or their home computer. With read-only drives, you can use the all fixed drives option and make the C drive read-only. And if I press OK, now nothing would be able to save to the C drive. It won't be able to save to the desktop or any of the other folders. As you can imagine, there might be applications that do need to save to the local hard drive in order to function properly, and that's where privileged applications come in. Privileged applications are where you can configure exceptions to the normal file security rules. And for instance, I could put in notepad.exe and click the configure button and maybe add star.txt, and this would allow Notepad to save text files anywhere that it wanted to. Now, obviously, configuring Notepad to save text files isn't very earth-shattering. The more common use for privileged applications are for things like your antivirus program. So maybe you would put in antivirus.exe, and you could put the full path to the program. And then once you do that, you can click configure, and you can actually put in star. And this will give antivirus.exe the ability to save any file it wants to on the hard drive. And that's typically what you would want with your network management tools or antivirus tools, is to let them do whatever they want so they can update their antivirus definitions or run anything that they need to run. There are tabs for directories that can be browsed, and registry access is enabled by default for privileged applications. So again, I can just press OK to close that configuration window and then press OK, and now Notepad and antivirus.exe are privileged, and the settings that are in the no access or the read-only no longer apply to these programs. You can also completely enable and disable different categories of USB Firewire drives. And when they're disabled, what that means is if the user sticks the USB drive into the computer, in the case of a flash drive, they put a thumb drive in and it's disabled in Fortress 101, it will not be assigned a drive letter, and we basically intercept the mounting of the drive and deny it so it doesn't even show up on the computer. This can be useful if you're concerned about people taking documents off of the computer with a thumb drive. The next four options I'm going to skip over because they relate to blocking applications from browsing. I don't recommend using the file browsing except under special circumstances, and if you think you might want to do that, I would recommend contacting technical support and see, because it can dramatically increase the configuration, because most programs do need to browse portions of the hard drive in order to function properly, and you can increase your configuration time a lot once you start blocking applications from browsing. The last four options on the File and Registry Settings page are for different system accounts, whether it's the administrator, system, local service, or network service. By default, the security settings apply to those threads. If you wanted to allow the system account to do whatever it wants, and this is typically your services that are running on the computer, you can double-click and choose Disabled, and that will allow system threads to do whatever they want on the computer without Fortress 101 getting involved with it. So those are the file and registry settings. Kiosk mode, this message comes up just to let you know that when you're in kiosk mode, there isn't a way to shut the computer down, so you use Control-Shift-S to shut the computer down, and then that will prompt you for an administrative user inside of the Fortress security interface to actually be able to shut the computer down. I'm going to click OK to dismiss that box. There are a lot of options in here. Basically, at the top you have the option to turn on whether or not a website is launched whenever a user logs in, and you have the ability to set that website or application, and then if it is an application, you can set up any command line parameters. You can also set up the auto logon so that it sets up a username, password, and domain, and will auto log the computer in whenever it starts. And then you have the option to block a lot of different keystrokes. These are mostly inside of Internet Explorer so that users aren't able to use that part of the keystroke to mess around when they're in kiosk mode. All of these settings are disabled unless the kiosk mode option at the top of the screen is enabled. So unless this option is enabled, none of these other options are going to take effect. The internet settings is where you can configure internet filtering. This allows you to either block a list of URLs or allow a list of URLs. It's not a content filter, it's basically just a whitelist or a blacklist, and allows you to set up what sites they can get to or that are blocked from. The most common use of the internet settings is to have a list of URLs that you want to allow, a finite list, maybe less than a dozen, and then use the allow only URLs listed option, set that to be enabled, and now the only websites the user would be able to go to are the sites that are in the URLs to allow list. If you're using a proxy server, you can configure that inside of Fortress 101 so it routes the traffic to the external proxy server in case you're using a content filter and want to use that with Fortress 101 as well. The startup and shutdown options allow you to control what is available when the shutdown screen comes up. When the start screen or the start button is disabled, when the user clicks on the start button, it'll come up with the shutdown windows option. And by default, the only options that are there are log off, shutdown, and restart. If you want to change which options are available, you can just click and choose to enable or disable the different options, and then those options will be the only ones available in that window. You can also configure auto logon from this page as well, and that has the same effect as setting it up on the kiosk mode page. The special applications I mentioned earlier that I would come back to an option on the basic settings page. Basically, special applications allow you to, or allow us rather, to insert settings into the privileged applications so that even if you make the C drive read-only, these applications will still function properly. And as long as on the basic settings page you have automatically configure special applications set to enabled, what Fortres 101 will do is when the user logs in, we'll do a quick check to see if any of these programs are installed. If they are, then we'll insert the settings so that they can function properly. It's a very fast scan in the registry to detect if they're installed or not, and if they are, then we insert those settings automatically so that you don't have to. The last window we'll talk about is the Diagnostics window, and this is where we log everything that we've blocked. So that could be desktop items, also file system, registry, any kind of web filtering that we've done, all would be logged in here. The most common use of this window is when dealing with technical support. You can go to the Details button, and this will give a report that shows some system information as well as all of your security settings, and what you can do is save this as an RTF file and then send that to tech support so that we can see what settings you have, and that's useful if you're working with maybe an antivirus program trying to get it configured and that antivirus program is not in our special applications list. So that's the main use of the Diagnostics window. So that is a quick overview of the features and the options that are inside of Fortres 101. If you have any questions, you can call our toll-free number, option 1 for sales if you'd like a quote, option 2 if you have any technical support questions. You can also email us at either sales@fortresgrand.com or support@fortresgrand.com. We also have online chat available on our website in the upper right corner where you can click and get connected to a support representative there. So definitely feel free to contact us, and we'd be happy to hear from you and answer any questions you may have. I appreciate your time and hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.